For over a century, a concrete wall on the Elwha River in Washington state held back almost everything that made this river what it was. Not just water, an entire migration, one of the largest salmon runs the Pacific Northwest had ever recorded, cut off at a single point and never allowed to reach the mountains again. Then, after 106 years, engineers did something almost nobody believed they'd actually go through with. They tore the dam down, piece by piece, and what happened to this river afterward didn't just surprise scientists. It rewrote what they thought they knew about how fast a river can come back from the dead. Before any of this, the Elwha was almost mythical. It ran nearly 45 miles from high in the Olympic Mountains down to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and every single one of its major fish species used to migrate the entire length, all the way up into the high country to spawn. Local accounts from before the dams describe Chinook salmon so large, some pushing near 100 pounds, that they were spoken of almost like folklore. Historic estimates put the river's total annual salmon run near 400,000 fish. Not one species. All of them combined, moving as one enormous ancient migration twice a year. The lower Elwha Clallam people had lived alongside that migration for generations, building their entire way of life around a river that never stopped giving. Then, in 1910, a businessman decided the Elwha's real value wasn't in its fish. It was in its drop, nearly 50 feet of it, ideal for a hydroelectric dam that could power the growing timber mills nearby. Construction crews built the Elwha Dam without a fish ladder, in direct violation of the state law requiring one. Nobody stopped them. The dam went up anyway, and the moment it did, the entire salmon run above it was simply erased. A second dam, Glines Canyon, went up further upstream a decade later. Two walls now stood between the ocean and 90% of the river's original habitat. For the tribe, this wasn't an economic loss. It was closer to losing a language. Salmon fed their communities, structured their ceremonies, tied generations together, and now the fish simply couldn't get there. Above the dams, entire stretches of the Elwha that had supported spawning runs for thousands of years fell completely silent. Below them, the river choked on sediment the dams trapped, instead of carrying naturally down to the coast, starving beaches and estuaries of the material they needed to survive. A river built on constant motion had been frozen in place, one small section at a time, for 100 years. By the 1980s, biologists studying the Elwha started building a case that most people in the region considered borderline unthinkable. Remove both dams entirely, not modify them, not add fish ladders decades too late. Take them out completely and let the river run free for the first time in a century. It took over 20 years of studies, lawsuits, and political fights before Congress actually authorized it in 1992. Even then, the removal didn't start until 2011. This became the largest dam removal project in United States history at the time. A nearly $325 million effort to dismantle both structures and, just as critically, manage the roughly 24 million cubic yards of sediment trapped behind them so it didn't bury the river downstream in one catastrophic pulse. Engineers had never removed anything at this scale before. There was no full playbook. They had to invent one as they went, lowering the dams gradually, notch by notch, over nearly 3 years, watching the river's reaction in real time to make sure they weren't creating a new disaster while trying to fix an old one. Picture what that actually looked like on the ground. Excavators chipping away at concrete that had stood since before either World War, one careful notch at a time, while downstream gauges tracked every shift in watercolor and flow. Crews weren't just watching for progress, they were watching for warning signs. Too much sediment released too fast could smother the exact habitat they were trying to save, choking the gravel bed salmon need to lay their eggs before a single fish ever got the chance to swim home. Every notch cut into that wall was a calculated risk, made in front of a river nobody could fully predict. And this is the part almost nobody expected going in. Scientists assumed the sediment release alone might set the recovery back for a decade. Instead, the river started reshaping itself almost immediately. New gravel bars appeared within months. The river delta at the coast, which had been starved of sediment for 100 years, began rebuilding beaches that hadn't existed in living memory. But the real question, the one every biologist on this project actually cared about, was whether the fish would come back at all. 100 years is a long time for a migration to stay dormant. Nobody had solid proof that salmon still remembered a path they hadn't swum in 3 or 4 generations. Within a year of the final removal in 2014, Chinook salmon were already showing up above where Glines Canyon Dam used to stand. Not a handful. Enough that researchers tracking the run had to revise their recovery models almost immediately. Steelhead trout followed. Then coho, bull trout, once boxed into a shrinking fragment of habitat below the dams, started reappearing in tributaries they hadn't touched in 100 years. By 2019, Chinook were being documented spawning nearly 40 miles upstream, deep into Olympic National Park, in stretches of river no living salmon had reached since before either dam existed. Nobody had a firm number for how fast the run would recover to its historic size. Some of the more careful researchers on the project were candid that full recovery could still take decades. But the direction of the data, the speed of that first return, stunned people who'd spent their careers assuming 100 years of damage doesn't just undo itself in a few spawning seasons. At a ceremony held during the dam removal, Robert Ellefson, River Restoration Director for the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe, stood on the riverbank where his own ancestors had watched the water disappear generations earlier. He didn't talk about hydroelectric output or sediment tonnage. He talked about his grandchildren someday being able to fish the same river his grandparents had fished, before any of this had a name like restoration attached to it. For a project measured mostly in cubic yards and megawatts everywhere else, that was the one moment that made it feel like what it actually was. Here's the twist nobody saw coming once the celebrations died down. The Elwha's comeback made it one of the most talked about rivers in the country, and Olympic National Park suddenly had a new headline attraction. Visitors poured in to see the restored river valley, the new gravel bars, the reappearing beaches at the coast. Trails that used to sit quietly now see heavy seasonal traffic. Park managers who spent decades fighting to bring this river back are now managing an entirely different problem: protecting a freshly recovering ecosystem from the exact kind of pressure that made people want to see it in the first place. The dams are gone. The concrete that stood for 106 years is gone with them. Some of it hauled away, some of it left to erode naturally into the canyon it once blocked. The river doesn't care about any of that. It's still doing exactly what it did for thousands of years before anyone decided to interrupt it, carrying gravel to the coast, carving new channels through the mountains, carrying salmon home. One decision, made after decades of people insisting it couldn't be done, undid a century of silence in a matter of seasons. If you want to see what happens as this recovery keeps unfolding over the next decade, subscribe. Because the Elwha isn't finished rewriting itself, and neither is this story.